thanks for having me. My name's Elliott. I'm here from ETH Zurich on the other side of the river. Today I'll talk about building a robot judge, what role for artificial intelligence in judicial decision making. This is an interesting and exciting problem right now because AI is really getting good enough to make some very interesting and difficult and complex decisions. Some recent studies have shown, for example, that people now trust robots more than they would trust a human financial advisor with their money. Humans would now trust a robot more than their boss. And I think perhaps even most interestingly, a recent poll in the UK found that 1 in 4 think that robots would do better than politicians in making government decisions. So politicians are an example of a public official, and the one that I'll focus on today is another one, judges. And this is part of this new and exciting set of technologies in legal tech. And granted, a lot of this is overhyped. I think that we're not close to having a court-appointed chatbot who could take over your legal advice in making legal decisions. But there definitely are some building blocks for a robot judge, and today I'll tell you about those. So one of the motivations for why you might want to have some machines and some robots contributing to the legal system is that human judges can make mistakes, and they can be biased, and they can be inconsistent. And one well-known example in the United States context is US asylum courts, where depending on which asylum court you end up at as an asylee, you have much different chances of getting asylum. And actually, even in the same court, you come into a court, you're randomly assigned to a judge, and if you luck out and get the easy judge, you have a 91% chance of getting asylum, but if you get the difficult judge, you only have a 3% chance. So this is really just a roll of the dice, and most people wouldn't call this justice. This isn't just a problem in the US. There's some similar work in Switzerland showing that in the federal administrative courts, there's a lot of variation. Which judge you get has an impact on whether you get asylum or not. So the broader question here, should we use robot judges to team up with human judges to make decisions more consistent? So I'm going to tell you about a more specific example of how machines can help to try to motivate this. So one problem in many countries, developing and developed, is corruption. And some recent studies have put the number for the value of corruption in the trillions of dollars. And so one question is, given that the stakes of having some anti-corruption policy and detecting corruption and enforcing corruption in place, what can machine learning and artificial intelligence help? So in some recent research with my colleagues at ETH, we've been building a robot corruption detector. We have data from Brazil, which has some convenient data for this, and also a large number of corruption audits where they randomly sent auditors to about 1,500 municipalities. They go through the books, look through the accounts for 2 or 3 weeks, and they find out, is there corruption in this municipality or not? So I don't think this would happen in Swiss municipalities, but in Brazil, this is a big problem, and about half of the municipalities have significant corruption. And this is basically where they promise to build a school for $1 million, but then they build a shack, and they take the rest of the money. So this is a really big problem. It causes a lot of social harm. And so if we can use machines to replicate what the human auditors do, we can make this a much more efficient process, detect more corruption, and hopefully deter it in the future. So we take data. Basically, we have the big spreadsheets from every municipality on what they spend money on, and we have the robot go through these spreadsheets and look for patterns that are associated with corruption. And the answer to this question of can corruption be detected using machine learning, the answer is yes. So it's about 72% accurate. So that's not enough to say, okay, well, the robot says you're corrupt, you're going to jail. But it actually is very useful because we can decide where to send human auditors based on these risk scores. And you get this immediate payoff. So Previously, we only knew where corruption was in a relatively small number of municipalities in Brazil because these are the ones where large teams of auditors have gone in and gone through the books. But we can now automate that process and say, where in Brazil is corruption likely to be found? So in the paper, we simulate using this robot corruption detector to target audits. So rather than just randomly sending 200 audit teams out to different municipalities, let's start with the most risky municipalities based on corruption. And we go from having about detecting corruption about half the time to almost double. So detecting corruption, almost twice as much corruption as before. So this is a really big contribution to anti-corruption policy. Keeping the same number of audits constant, we can detect twice as much corruption. So this results from Brazil, I think, are an example of kind of a relatively well-defined problem of detecting corruption, and we have data on it, but they speak to using machines to support justice-based decision-making. And these methods would be generalizable to other settings where you have an audit decision and some nice data for detecting these patterns. So there are some caveats. Happy to answer those in Q&A. What we've established so far is how robot judges can support more efficient decisions. But if we think about robot judges replicating the decisions of human judges, which are biased, won't the robot judges be biased? This is potentially a big problem. And you can think of some examples. For example, in education, when we have automated essay grading, if the essay grading software is trained to replicate the grades by biased teachers, so teachers might be biased against some people from different parts of the country or from different ethnicities or different origins, the automated essay grading software will learn those biases and reproduce them in the automated test scores. In medicine, you see the same thing where if doctors don't know as much about some populations of individuals, they will make more mistakes in the human doctor decisions. Any robot doctor that's trained to replicate human doctor decisions will also be biased. And in my own research area, you see this in criminal risk scoring, where the risk scoring software doesn't use the ethnicity or race of the defendant explicitly, but it can learn proxies and be biased against them because of bias in the data. So a question that we have to ask ourselves when we're using algorithms or AI to make decisions is how to make them fair. So I have an example here when you're trying to decide about bail, putting someone in jail or not while they're awaiting trial. You probably want to use criminal record because this will tell you how likely they are to commit crimes. You might want to use education because this is some proxy for likelihood of committing crimes. But you don't want to use the religion of the defendant, whether they're Muslim or not, for example. And the standard approach in machine learning is to throw all the data in the hopper, get as good a prediction as possible, and this seems unfair. You wouldn't want to use someone's protected attribute like religion. So one approach would be, well, just don't give this information on religion to the algorithm. But the problem is that other characteristics, such as education, will form proxies for this protected attribute. And there's this problem of indirect discrimination is quite difficult to address. There's no perfect solutions for addressing the issue of bias in AI systems. And we just have to keep in mind that the baseline is not a perfectly fair AI. The relevant comparison is a human judge who may also be biased. And I think we think of artificial intelligence as being a black box, and that's a problem. We don't know what's going on inside the machine. But just think about the human brain. It's also a black box. You don't know what's going on in there. So a lot of the supposed disadvantages of AI decision-making systems are also there for human decision-making systems. And I think it's fair to say that because we can, at least to some extent, open the box and look at how the machinery is working, looking at the gears inside the robot judge, I think there's actually a better chance of understanding bias in an automated decision system than in a human decision system. Also, I wanted to add to that and say that the same tools that are used to support decision-making by AI systems can also be used to detect bias in human judges. So an example of that from my own work is gender bias in the US judiciary. If you just do some Google searches about this, it's easy to find some really quite unfortunate situations that have gone on in recent years. But we want to do something broader and look at gender stereotypes in the judiciary more broadly. And we do that by using technologies from natural language processing, having machines actually read the judicial opinions that judges write, and seeing what biases and associations and stereotypes exist in those opinions. And if you just look at the adjectives that judges tend to use when they're talking about men in their opinions or women in their opinions, you can see some quite striking stereotypical differences. So for men, you see alert, understanding, active, and for women, you see irritable, hostile, rude, immature. And we want to know, does this actually, these differences in how judges talk about different genders, is it reflected in differences in their decisions? The technology that we use to analyze the language of judges, it's called word embeddings. And you can think about this as representing words and documents in this geometric space. You know, the word for man is here, woman is here, king is here, queen is here, and there's this parallel direction that encodes gender. So we can use this really exciting technology to analyze different dimensions of language in large corpora of judicial opinions. So in our case, we look at the gender dimension, male to female, and how correlated or associated it is with the dimension for work versus family. This is this classic stereotype, right, where men are associated with the office and work and careers, women are associated with the home and family and children. And we can actually look in the judicial opinions, is that stereotype there statistically in the text? So one thing we find, it's quite intuitive. Men are more stereotyped than women in the judiciary. Something that I thought that was a little bit more intriguing is that for either men or women judges, if they have more daughters, they use less gender stereotypes. So I think this is kind of intuitive. And we also look at how this relates to their decisions and behavior. So it does, in the sense that compared to their colleagues, the judges that use more gender stereotypes tend to vote against women's rights in terms of reproductive rights, sexual harassment, gender discrimination. And it even affects how they treat their colleagues. So the more stereotyped judges tend to disagree with and reject the decisions of female judges, and they're less likely to cite them. So these are professionally relevant metrics, and so it's an important motivating issue for representation in the judiciary. So back to the original question, when should algorithms support human decision making? Something that we've all become very familiar with, we use it in our phones, is face and voice recognition. So, and then you might also think of this as medical diagnosis from scans. Machines have gotten really good at this very kind of simple decision-making task. There are high risks of privacy violations due to the high accuracy, but I think those are surmountable issues, and there's already established legal precedents for dealing with those problems. It also could be that the systems are biased towards some groups due to lack of data. So this is the example that I was saying earlier, that a robot doctor might not make the right decision for the types of patients where they don't see very much information because they just don't have as many cases. This is an important practical problem, but it's surmountable by collecting more data. The second type of decisions that I wanted to consider are machine decisions based on past behavior. So this includes, for example, copyright infringement, spam detection, automated essay grading, as I mentioned, corruption detection in the municipalities that I mentioned. These are more complex, right? But and they're also kind of subjective. So, what counts as copyright infringement? What counts as spam? There's going to be some gray areas there. But humans agree enough, and the resulting machines agree enough that these predictions are quite useful for making decisions. So one thing that we also do have to keep aware of is that these are incentive systems, and you can see this all the time with the arms race about spam detection, where spammers are getting better and better, but the detection algorithms are also getting better. We have to be aware that this same process will be there, for example, for medical treatment decisions and for corruption detection. So you have to continually monitor and update these systems in response to human behavior. The third type and most, I think, difficult and set of decisions where we have to be most careful for using AI is making decisions about predicted future behavior. So I mentioned this in the case of predicted recidivism, so if you're going to put somebody in jail or not, based on whether you think they'll commit more crimes, whether you allocate police to neighborhoods because you think there will be more crime there in the future, or admittedly using this text-based measure of gender attitudes to try to nominate or promote judges. You have to be really careful about doing that. The main reason being is that what you decide will then change what this future behavior will be. So if you make a prediction about somebody that's going to commit more crimes, but then you put them in jail, they're now incarcerated, so they won't commit more crimes, and you don't know if you're right or not. And so once you introduce these systems, it's difficult for them to maintain good information on how accurate they are. And because you don't observe the counterfactual, there could be drift in the data, and they could become quite inaccurate, and you wouldn't know. Also, especially in the case of putting someone in jail or not, it's a super high-stakes decision, right? If you make a mistake, it's very costly. And because of these strong incentive responses, there could be a lot of unpredictable outcomes as a result. That's my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions and comments. Thank you.